CMMC and 48 CFR are redefining readiness across the defense supply chain. With this new rule taking effect November 10th, 2025, a secure, auditable system is now the baseline. Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Bankhead with Caius Commercial Services. Today, I'm joined by Mark Savage, consultant and CEO of Strategic Security, to dig into what these changes really mean for contractor readiness.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for inviting me to talk today. Before we get started, I have a couple of brief comments. I have 35 years in cybersecurity and over 25 years of that in enterprise consulting environments, commercial, federal, and defense. What we're talking about today is my opinion and doesn't represent legal advice.
Sounds good, Mark. Let's talk about the rapidly approaching federal regulation. Title 48, update that enforces the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, framework within the Department of Defense, DoD, contracts. What should defense contractors really expect as we approach the November 10th, 2025 deadline?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, Steve. Obviously, that date is rapidly approaching. So the CMMC framework was first introduced under 32 CFR back in 2024 as a voluntary program to get people on pace and start there. Now, November 10th is about to change all that. On the 10th, 48 CFR makes CMMC mandatory. This first phase will start showing up in DoD contracts. I may make the comment that it's already starting to show up if you look at things in sam.gov and some of the contracts that are coming out, but it becomes mandatory on the 10th of November. You'll also want to keep an eye on your contract modifications that add DFARS 252-204-7025, because that will be the regulation that will show up in your existing contract modifications that will set your CMMC level and what applies to that contract vehicle. CMMC level 1, level 2, self-assessed, level 2, third-party assessed, level 3, which would be done by DIBCAC. So generally speaking, to be eligible for DoD awards, organizations will need two things in place at the base. One will be a passing SPRS score based on your current CMMC level recorded in the system, and SPRS being the supplier performance risk system that the government provides. Secondly, you'll have, and this is new under 48 CFR, a current affirmation from your senior leadership of continued compliance based on your passing score. That will have to go into SPRS as well. For existing contracts, it'll be up to the contract officer when those clauses are added. There is actually a statement in there that says at the discretion of the contract officer. But as of the 10th, being mandatory, in most cases, we expect to see introduction through what we call bilateral contract modification. So that's if you have a contract today, through that modification or through your option year, that's where it will show up. Typically during an option year or period of performance extension is where we see this most likely to show up with this DFARS 7025, okay? The bottom line here is that if you wait until the contract officer adds this clause, you're likely too late. The best move right now is to strengthen your readiness. So there are three phases that we consider. Phase 1 for the government is readiness, getting yourself ready to be assessed. Phase 2 is the assessment itself, and phase 3 is the certification process. So know where you stand, close your gaps for readiness, get ready for certification, and be ready for the next contract cycle.
Thanks, Mark. That really helps clarify what's changing and when. How about taking it a step farther? Who exactly will be required to have a CMMC certification under these new rules?
That's the question everybody is asking me. And most start with, well, that doesn't apply to us, right? Well, the reality is it probably does. Significant portion, very small percentage as designated by the government will be either not CMMC or will be CMMC level 1. Most folks will fall into the CMMC level 2 category, which is what everybody is mostly concerned about, where they will fall in that. If your organization processes, stores, or transmits federal contract information, which is called FCI, or includes DoD contract data or controlled unclassified information, which means essentially CUI, you'll hear it called in many cases CUI, you fall under the scope of CMMC. That applies whether you're a prime contractor, a subcontractor, or a vendor anywhere in the defense supply chain. These requirements apply to all systems that handle FCI and CUI. FCI is a broader set of government data than CUI is. CUI is usually more restricted, but you need to understand they both apply here. And if your organization doesn't have both, one, a passing score in the SPRS as reflected by your current CMMC level under the voluntary state, or two, a current affirmation, right, with a passing score, or you're not eligible for DoD awards, period. So what I'm stating here is you're likely CMC will apply. You're going to need those two things that I stated previously, or you're not going to be eligible for DoD awards. End of statement. That's what the DoD CIO, that's what everybody has been telling folks. So I want to make sure I'm clear on that point. Now, there are a few limiting exceptions, right? Everybody always wants to go, how do I get out of not doing CMMC? So, for example, if you're a company that only provides 100% COTS products, that's commercial off-the-shelf hardware or software sold exactly as is with no changes or modifications, then CMMC generally does not apply to you. But those cases are really the exception to the rule, okay? In most situations, even if a company believes it's outside of scope, it's not that simple. Many organizations think they're not handling CUI data, when in reality, they've either received CUI data from the government that may not have been marked properly, or they may be creating CUI in the execution of the work that they're doing under that government contract. So let me give you a real-world example of what I ran into for one telecom last year. So a telecom company I was worked with didn't have CUI designated in their contract, okay? But when I reviewed their service management portions of their process, think of B2B business process, sales and marketing, finance, invoicing, and then you've got service management, and then ultimately operations, sort of the life cycle of that business process. In this case, we realized that they were producing CUI itself through site survey documents. And what I mean here in the telecom space, they were doing detailed layouts to plans for equipment installation, for mapping the network connections, showing exactly where ports and hardware would be in this case, in a government building, identifying the electrical ports and tie-ins, right? All the things that might show up in an engineering-based site survey for this telecom, right? They shared that information with their subcontractors and their vendors, right? Which is what you would expect. They may be subcontracting to tier 2 or tier 3 to do portions of that work, right? So everyone could see what they needed to do and what they had to execute for that project. But here's what they were missing. One, they never checked those site survey details against the NARA CUI registry. right? So they didn't realize, had they realized and looked at that registry, they would have realized that they were creating what's called controlled technical information, CTI. It falls under a broader category of covered defense information, but they would have realized that. They never went back to the contracting officer after we raised this to confirm whether the data should be categorized as CUI. You should never make that assumption that CTI automatically means CUI. There can be restrictions or reasons why the government doesn't want it designated that way, but you always need to go back to the contract officer if you believe you may be interacting or creating CUI. And lastly, their legal team internal advised them not to raise the issue. Now, I'm not a legal representative. I said it at the beginning. But in the case of the government and government contracts, that legal guidance is a challenge, potentially under the False Claims Act and under Department of Justice. So you have to recognize in this regard that situation. And it's not the only type of situation I've run into, but you need to be aware that I've given you just one example of where I've seen this happen in real time. The problem is, in this regard, in this example, the site survey often includes controlled technical information, or CTI, as I mentioned earlier, which is a type of CUI. The contract officer ultimately makes the final determination, as I made, but it's the contractor's responsibility, fiduciary responsibility, to flag and clarify that, not just to say, it's not my responsibility, I didn't label it, I didn't know I was creating it, right? That neglect under the False Claims Act will cause them problems. So in this case, by not confirming the data classification, they expose themselves to unnecessary risk, technically referred to as what we, from a security perspective, would refer to as a CUI data leak, which now equates to a breach and a requirement to do an urgent notification to that contract officer, right? Potentially identifying that as a non-compliant fine for CMMC, right? So sort of hiding that doesn't help. What's important here is that the issue wasn't buried in the IT system, right? This was hidden inside the business processes rooted on broader systemic issues, right? So that's why our company uses what we call Compass Readiness Framework, or CRF, right? To look across the entire organization and these B2B process, not just the technical controls and the assessment objectives, because the readiness isn't just a cybersecurity problem from my perspective. It's a business alignment problem, right? It starts with business and systemic issues. And even if a company believes they're outside the scope today, or that their current contracts don't involve FCI or CUI, the smarter move, in my opinion, is to prepare now. Build your readiness, close your gaps, avoid being caught off guard when those eligibility requirements for 7025 show up, and be positioned to make a better determination as to when that assessment, when you're ready for that assessment.
So that really covers the landscape for the defense agencies, the defense side. But what about widening the lens? Most people think CMMC, immediately they think Department of Defense only. But should organizations with contracts across other federal agencies be aware of it? And is it relevant to them?
Absolutely. So CMMC is really the canary in the coal mine. What I mean as an early indicator of how the government's internal CUI programs may be mirrored to contract requirements once the FAR CUI final rule is finalized and aligned in 48 CFR. So most people don't recognize that actually the federal government started this under GSA and OMB, and DoD waited to see that guidance, and it got shelved. So Department of Defense decided to go take it upon themselves, which became CMMC. Now, interestingly enough, the federal side and the federal contracts are now very closely aligned to being ready to do the same thing, which is being called the FAR CUI final rule. So there are three sort of important points based on what you asked that I want to make sure I cover here. First, the foundation for all of this goes back to Executive Order 13556, which was issued way back in 2010. That order required every federal agency, not defense, every federal agency to follow a consistent program for handling CUI, instead of each agency using its own rule, right? So it wanted to bring it together and have all the federal agencies handle CUI the same way. The problem was that OMB and GSA never finished publishing that FAR CUI rule that would have made it an official act across the government. So the Department of Defense, as I made mention, moved forward on its own and created CMMC under DFARS, okay? Which DFARS is a subset of FAR regulations under the broader FAR, federal regulations. Second, that missing FAR CUI final rule is already in a pipeline. It was proposed for release early in this past year. It's now in final review stage, which means it's gone through ORA. Once published, okay, it will establish that uniform CUI requirement for all federal contractors, okay, and their contract vehicles, not just those working on DoD. So if you have just federal contracts today, FAR CUI final rule is coming soon. And we believe it will closely, at least I believe in my opinion, it will closely mirror what CMMC requires today for DoD contractors, okay? Lastly, based on where the rulemaking stands, we expect to see the FAR CUI final rule issued sometime in the first half of 2026. My rationale for that is that GSA and others are heavily engaged in a FAR rewrite now for the administration, but they've gotten through their first phase. They're continuing to work on that. So at some point, they're going to pick up this GSA is going to pick up this FAR CUI final rule and maybe make some adjustments, maybe not, but publish it in the Federal Registry. When that happens, the federal agencies will have the authority to build their own compliance program very similar to CMMC and include those requirements in their contracts, right? So the largest takeaway in this, based on your question, was while CMMC may be the defense-specific compliance framework today, it's defining how the entire federal government will likely handle cybersecurity and controlled and classified information and align it all under what's called NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act. That's where Congress funds all of these activities. The compliance program, CMMC, would be doing the same thing under this. So you probably should expect to be watching for that and see that if you have federal contracts today.
Well, Mark, this has been an incredibly informative conversation. Thank you for breaking things down so clearly for everyone.
My pleasure, Steve. The big takeaway is this. Readiness, in my mind, is no longer an option. Whether you're in the defense supply chain or you're working with other federal agencies in the federal industrial base, the expectation for cybersecurity controls and compliance, right, these regulated industries and the controls are tightening fast. As these requirements continue to evolve, be ready early isn't just about compliance anymore. It's about transforming your readiness into resiliency and trust. The kind of trust and resiliency the government demands of you, which in turn will protect your revenue, right? Your revenue channel will reduce your risks to your business and drive long-term growth.
Mark, well said. If you understand that this means for your business and your contracts, a readiness review will help outline the key steps to protect your eligibility and reduce the risk. And if you have any questions, and if you would like to address those in a future session, please send them to questions@strategicsecurity.com. Also, with the November 10th quickly approaching, now's the time for everyone to act. Every day of delay increases your risk that new requirements could be added to your existing contracts. Schedule a 30-minute readiness and risk call with Mark to get started. It's a focused conversation to discuss where you are in your readiness journey and how you're managing risk today and what the next practical steps might look like for your organization. If you would like to schedule that one-on-one conversation, scan the QR code or visit strategicsecurity.com/schedule. If you would like to contact me, you can contact me at sbankhead@cayusecs.com. Thank you for joining us today and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Steve.